All right, everybody. Well, welcome back to Water Stories. I am super grateful today because we get to have these four beaver heroes with us that have given so much over decades to help them help us all bring back the beaver, because we all know the story of how beavers have been decimated over the last few centuries. And we owe our lives, we owe the story of our water to these beavers. We wouldn't be able to exist on these continents without these animals that created the water that regenerated our soils and kept our rivers healthy. And we almost wiped them out. So it's a miracle that there was enough left that we can create a new story of bringing them back. And so it's amazing to have Molly and Sharna and Brock and Ben on here to show a new story of how we can bring back beavers and restore our waters, restore our rivers, and tell a story of regeneration and rewilding and hope through the restoration of beavers. So make sure to focus, turn off your cell phones. You want to be present for this. This is going to be a really awesome webinar, and everyone gets a replay after it. So stick around. And without further ado, I'm going to let Zach introduce these fine folks, and then we'll get the show on. We'll get started.
Yeah, so we've got four really amazing panelists today. It's really an honor to have all of you on here. Thank you. I'll introduce you each as we go. We're going to have Ben start, then Molly, then Sharna, and then Brock close. We'll have a little bit of time for discussion between the panelists, and then we'll get right into your guys' question and answers in the audience. So when we get to that question and answer period, if you want to ask your question with your voice, use the raise hand feature at the bottom of Zoom. Will allow you to unmute and ask your question, or you can enter them in the question and answer feature at any point during the talk here. So our first panelist, Ben Goldfarb, author of an amazing book, Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter. A really eye-opening book that one of my clients gave to us as we were working on these water restoration projects, and just incredible to really understand the history of these species and their impact on the landscape as a whole. So this is a book I definitely recommend you all check out if you haven't read it already. I'm gonna drop the link in the chat here. And without further ado, Ben, take it away.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Zach, for hosting and for inviting me. And I'm honored to be on this panel with Molly, Brock, and Sharna, who I consider three of the real giants of the beaver world. So it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. So we'll be talking today about beavers as active healers, right? But I think before we begin, it's important to establish a few basic beaver facts. What and who are these animals that we can work with to achieve all of these wonderful ecological goals? How do beavers make their living? What is a beaver? Beavers, of course, are rodents. They're North America's largest rodent, as Molly, who's handled more beavers than pretty much anybody alive, can attest. 40 to 60 pounds as an adult beaver, so they're bigger than most people realize, I think. And of course, they're semi-aquatic rodents, right? So they spend all of their life in and around water, and they've got all kinds of wonderful adaptations for this kind of unique semi-aquatic niche they fill. We talk about beavers as kind of restoration tools, but they're also just evolutionary marvels. They've got extraordinarily dense fur, one of the densest pelts in the animal kingdom, which of course was their downfall, and we'll talk about that in a minute. They've got these wonderful webbed duck-like hind feet, very powerful, agile swimmers. A second set of transparent eyelids called the nictitating membrane that functions like a set of goggles, as well as a second set of lips, kind of this fur-lined valve behind their front teeth, so they can chew and drag branches underwater without drowning. I think that's a pretty cool beaver feature. And then, of course, the beaver's most iconic feature is its tail, right? The tail is sort of this amazing Swiss Army knife. It's a fat storage device. It's a rudder while they swim, and of course it's an alarm system, right? I'm sure that many of you have heard the smack of a beaver's tail striking the water to warn other beavers about the presence of predators. And then they've also got this, this wonderful set of kind of self-sharpening, chisel-like iron reinforced teeth, their top and bottom incisors, which is important when you spend your whole life cutting down trees, right? Beavers eat cambium, which is the inner bark of trees, aspen, willow, cottonwood. Those are kind of the big three iconic beaver food species. They do take pretty much any deciduous tree in the right circumstances. They also eat, lots of green herbaceous stuff, wildflowers, water lilies. You see them basically mow people's lawns for them. So they have pretty diverse diets, but they are totally herbivorous. And of course, in addition to using to cutting down wood as a food source, they also use wood as a construction material, right? They're very efficient. They build with the same stuff that they eat, essentially. And there are two basic types of beaver structure that most of you have probably seen. The first is the lodge. That's kind of the fundamental beaver housing unit. In the lodge, you've got two to as many as 8 or so beavers. That's the male and female, and then 3 kind of year classes of offspring, the kits, the 1-year-olds, and the 2-year-olds. And then those 2-year-olds will disperse out, looking for their own territories, like teenagers heading off to college or something. And then, of course, in addition to the lodge, you've got the dam, right? The other iconic beaver structure that most of you have probably seen. Beavers build dams as a form of safety or shelter, essentially, right? A beaver on land is kind of this big, fat, slow, smelly package of meat that's going to get eaten by, any large carnivore. So by building a dam and expanding the extent of that aquatic habitat, they're basically engineering their own environment, right? They're, instead of having to walk overland to that good-looking aspen tree, they can swim close to it instead, and then cut it down and float it back to the lodge in relative safety. So they're really, engineering their own habitat. But of course, in the process, they're changing landscapes really dramatically. Beaver dams come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. Typical colony is building one kind of large primary dam and then a number of sort of smaller secondary dams. Sometimes you see colonies building as many as 15 or 20 dams. I just really like this one. I just love the kind of the perfection of this radial arc here. This is a beautiful dam in the Collegiate Peaks here in Colorado where I live. And here's a really spectacular specimen in Voyageurs National Park in Minnesota, which is sort of I think America's beaver mecca. And in addition to, of course, these dams they're constructing are impounding an enormous amount of water in some cases, right? I'm always impressed by their hydrological savvy. Here's a 300-acre or so beaver pond that's formed by, a single strategically placed dam at the kind of the narrow constriction or outflow of this canyon. So beavers are storing certainly hundreds of thousands and in some cases millions of gallons of water in the ponds that they engineer with their dam building. Beavers are also prolific diggers. We don't talk about that enough, I think, but they sort of excavate these elaborate canal networks that radiate out away from the pond and are a really important way that they kind of spread water across the landscape. And, and really, there's essentially irrigation ditches, right, that they're, digging out onto the floodplain and moving water around and hydrating these wonderful wetlands and wet meadows. So beavers, of course, they're building these ponds and wetlands and digging these canals to enhance their own habitat. But in the process, they're creating phenomenal habitat for all kinds of other creatures as well, right? We know that here in the American West, wetlands cover about 2% of the total land area and support 80% of the biodiversity. So any animal that's capable of expanding and creating wetlands is really important, right? And it's practically impossible to name a species that doesn't benefit from beavers at some point in its life cycle. But a few kind of iconic ones, other semi-aquatic mammals, right? Moose, otter, muskrat, mink. Here's a moose hanging out in the beaver pond in Utah. Amphibians, this is a boreal toad, which is sort of our, iconic amphibian here in Colorado. And, in much of their range, boreal toads are basically beaver pond obligates. Beavers supply around 90% of their breeding habitat. So, very closely linked to beavers. Obviously, salmonids, juvenile trout and salmon, right? This is a baby steelhead, which is basically, a trout with a salmon life cycle. And if you're a juvenile fish, right, you don't want to be in the main stem river, you know, it's going to get blown downstream by the force of the current, right? You want to live in side channels and pools and eddies and meanders. You know, you want that kind of complex, slow water refuge habitat that beavers create. So there are a million studies linking beavers to trout and salmon production, and maybe Molly will talk about that a little bit too, because that's so central to the Tulalip's work. And then, you know, there's always just kind of, there's just so many cool, biological connections in beaver complexes that aren't necessarily, documented in the peer-reviewed literature, but are just so striking. Here's I love this kind of this anecdote. This is a beaver complex in Minnesota, and here you can sort of see. Here's you can see the old beaver dam at the back here, and the beavers vacated this area, or got predated or something, and the dam broke down, the pond drained, so you get this lush, nice kind of wet meadow that's really good forage for moose and deer and other critters. But the really cool thing here is that after this pond drained, the beaver lodge was left high and dry, and a pack of wolves actually moved into that lodge and raised their pups in the lodge. So that's beavers creating habitat for their direct predator. I think that's pretty incredible. And then just 2 weeks ago, I was in Utah with Joe Wheaton, famous beaver expert. And when we saw a sandhill crane on a beaver dam, I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. I've never seen a sandhill at a beaver complex before. So I took this picture, and then later I zoomed in, and the crane had actually nested and laid a clutch of eggs on top of the beaver dam. I think that's just unbelievable. So every time you visit a beaver pond, there's just some kind of extraordinary biological connection to observe. And I think it's important to recognize that humans, native people in North America, have understood the biological importance of beavers for many, many thousands of years, right? And there are lots of great accounts of this. But for example, Rosalind Lapierre, the wonderful Blackfeet ethnobotanist and historian, has written that the Blackfeet, for example, sanctified beavers, didn't kill beavers, really had cultural prohibitions against killing them, because they understood that, in this arid Western environment, beavers create these wonderful ecological oases on the landscape, which is why tribes like the Blackfeet didn't participate in the fur trade, because they knew how important these animals were and considered them sacred. So I think that, the notion of beavers as active healers and ecological partners, right? That's something that's certainly not new to Western science. That's something that native people have understood for a very long time. And, there are all kinds of wonderful ecosystem services that beavers provide, right? It's not just, moose and boreal toads and salmon that benefit from beavers. It's us as humans as well, of course. Obviously, they're fabulous drought mitigators, right? Here's a wonderful beaver complex at about 12,000 feet up in Independence Pass in Colorado. And you can just see, the incredible volume of water that's being captured by these linear features, these beaver dams. And there's also a far greater volume of groundwater that you can't see being stored in this complex. So as we lose our snowpack, as the West gets hotter and drier, well, hey, here are these animals that can build thousands of little reservoirs up in the high country to capture some of that precipitation and keep our rivers and streams hydrated deep into the summer and fall. So they're wonderful drought mitigators. They're also kind of incredible flood mitigators, right? You get a big pulse of stormwater, racing down a stream, and then it hits that beaver complex. And as Brock is fond of saying, the beavers slow it, spread it, store it, and sink it, right? They capture that water. And here's a wonderful beaver complex in Scotland, where Eurasian beavers have been reintroduced after a many century-long absence. So I think that's worth contemplating for a second, right? You've got drought, you've got flood, these two polar opposite problems on the hydrograph, and beavers can help us tackle them both. That's kind of magical, I think. They're fabulous irrigators, right? They're storing huge volumes of water and spreading it out laterally onto the floodplain, as well as, in the ground. Here's this guy's James Rogers, who's a rancher in Nevada, who, pointed out to me that beavers were basically increasing forage production for his livestock tenfold by irrigating the valleys in which he, runs his cattle. So, there are a lot of pro-beaver ranchers now, guys whose own fathers shot every beaver in their irrigation ditch, but have learned to embrace these animals. They're wonderful pollution capture devices, right? You get the nitrates and the phosphates and the heavy metals and the pesticides and all the stuff that's being carried along by the stream. And then, that stream hits the beaver pond, slows down, loses its energy. All of those suspended solids settle out. They're sequestering huge amounts of carbon as well in their complexes. And then, kind of the final beaver, or not the final, but, one of the really prominent beaver benefits that, has just become so, so in the zeitgeist right now, really thanks to the researcher Emily Fairfax, who's documented these effects. Beavers are wonderful firefighters, right? And water doesn't burn. And by spreading out water and by irrigating plants, beavers are creating these wonderful fire breaks and fire refugia on the landscape. And here's a picture in Idaho where you can see that the uplands have been burnt to a crisp, and the last kind of green, blue, wet, lush place on the landscape is that beaver influenced valley bottom. So beavers are, Emily's proposed changing the Forest Service's mascot from Smokey the Bear to Smokey the Beaver. And I think that's a long overdue change. So today, we don't exactly know how many beavers live in North America, something like 10 to 15 million, but that's just sort of a very ballpark guess, which, sounds like a lot, right? They're not an endangered species. But, I think it's important to remember that the beavers we have today are really just a tiny fraction of the beavers that we had historically, right? As, prior to European arrival, there were as many as 400 million beavers on this continent, and, perhaps a couple 100 million beaver ponds. And, a little back of the envelope math suggests that there were, maybe 230,000 square miles of land underwater thanks to beavers. And for reference, that's about the size of Nevada and Arizona put together. So beavers were just profoundly ubiquitous and profoundly influential on this continent. It's incredible to read accounts from old trappers and explorers and native oral histories about what this landscape used to look like when it had its full complement of beavers. There are accounts of explorers crossing, what is today Indiana, and not finding a dry place to camp for 100 miles because beavers had just sort of made everything soggy. Lewis and Clark described seeing beaver dams in every single tributary of the Missouri River, as far as the eye could see, up to the base of the mountains. But by the middle of the 19th century, beavers were more or less functionally extinct, and the reason for that was, of course, the fur trade. Beaver pelts make these kind of fine fur hats, these Victorian top hats that were, all the rage back in Europe. The fur trade really begins in the early 1600s in New England and kind of spreads west and south across the continent. And, again, by 1850 or so, beavers are functionally extinct in pretty much all of the lower 48. They're just, 100,000 or so kind of hanging on for dear life up in Canada. And, the fur trade was this hugely influential historical event. Practically every significant moment in American history prior to the Civil War has some kind of connection to the beaver economy. Here's a coin minted by the Oregon Territory, which covered the entirety of the Northwest. And basically the value of one beaver coin was fixed to the value of one beaver pelt. So the entire economy of the Northwest operated on the pelt standard. I think that's pretty incredible. In addition to being this, hugely significant historical kind of catastrophe, the fur trade was also this hugely significant ecological catastrophe, right? I mean, when you kill 400 million beavers and drain a couple 100 million beaver ponds, well, of course, that represents a catastrophic loss of habitat for all kinds of creatures, like the ones we mentioned earlier. And I think that we often see this kind of erosive, incised system and think, oh, that's probably the legacy of, overgrazing or mining or logging or some other destructive historical environmental impact. But in fact, this kind of unraveled, degraded, eroded, incised stream is, in many cases, the legacy of the beaver trade, right? And, in a beaver-rich stream, all of those dams are acting like speed bumps, slowing the water down and spreading it out. When you lose those beaver-built speed bumps, there's nothing checking the velocity of water, and you get this really kind of catastrophic incision and the disconnection of the stream and its floodplain, which we know is so important. So again, we're not accustomed to thinking about the beaver trade as thinking in the same terms as we think about overgrazing or the deforestation of New England or the busting of the Midwestern prairie as sort of this seminal environmental disaster. But there's no question that it was. And kind of one of the classic victims of this was the Coho Salmon, which historically relied on beaver ponds for its juvenile rearing habitat. What did it mean for Coho salmon, a species that that lost perhaps 97% of its rearing habitat as a result of the loss of beavers? Again, it's just an absolute environmental disaster for the coho and all kinds of other critters as well. By 1900 or so, and here's kind of the place that I'll leave off and let the rest of our panel take over. By 1900 or so, we'd started to wise up a little bit to recognize that, as the great naturalist Enos Mills put it, a live beaver is more valuable to mankind than a dead one. And we started to enact some trapping restrictions and reintroduce beaver in some of the places that it was historically native and had been trapped out. And throughout the 20th century, beaver populations begin to recover. So I think that we've kind of, if you can sort of think about beavers and humans as existing in this sort of multi-phased relationship where at one point native people, and still do, understood how important these animals were. We sort of lost that knowledge, I think, for a few hundred years as we extirpated these animals, and now we're trying to get back there to remember that, hey, yes, live beavers really are these incredibly valuable ecological healers. So what do we do about it? How do we act on that knowledge? How do we operationalize the understanding that beavers are these incredibly important ecological partners and restoration agents? And I'll let the rest of our panel fill in those gaps. So thank you guys very much.
Thank you, Ben. That was fantastic. Yeah, it was super. That was fun. What a great way to get a quick rundown. And, you put it into such good perspective. How insane is it that we destroyed the health of our landscape, made it more prone to drought, flood, and fire, all for fashion? That just never ceases to blow my mind. So our next panelist here that's going to really get into what we do about all of this is Molly Alves. She's a wildlife biologist for the Tulalip tribes of Washington and the manager of their Beaver Project, which partners with beavers through relocation and restoration to create habitat for these imperiled salmon on these tribal ancestral lands. So this fall, she'll embark on her next journey at Utah State University under the guidance of Emily Fairfax, who Ben mentioned as well. And I will post a link in the chat to their Beaver project here. And thank you. It's an honor and privilege and pleasure to have you on here, Molly.
Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for taking the time to listen today. Like Zach mentioned, my name is Molly Alves. I'm a wildlife biologist for the Tulalip tribes of Washington. And my primary role in this position is to maintain the subsistence resources of the Tulalip tribal members. So anything that they hunt or fish, it's my responsibility to ensure that the populations of those species are happy and healthy out on the landscape. And the most culturally significant of these species, of course, is the salmon. So I'm going to describe a little bit to you today about how and why we're partnering with beavers to restore ecological function for salmon within Tulalip's ancestral territory. So I want to start with a brief origin story because our project came about in a relatively unique way. This project started in 2014 as a kind of new, inventive, less expensive way to address salmon decline on a landscape scale. But to understand how that translated to a small tribe becoming the first Western Washington beaver relocators, I need to explain a few of the key elements that have defined our project. The first and most important of those elements is tribal sovereignty. Tulalip is a federally recognized tribe. And so when we began this work in 2014, it was illegal to relocate beavers in Western Washington. So we were and are to this day operating under the sovereign rights of the Tulalip tribes to restore and create salmon habitat within our ceded territory. And that territory is essentially all of the lands that were forfeited by tribes when they were placed on reservations at the signing of the treaties. And for Tulalip, that area runs from just north of Mount Rainier all the way up to the Canadian border in Western Washington, and they maintain hunting and fishing rights in this area as well as co-management responsibilities of the resources. So another element is that within this ceded territory lies the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest. And Tulalip has a longstanding memorandum of agreement with the United States Forest Service to co-manage their lands for restoration purposes. So under this existing agreement, the Forest Service agreed to be the recipients of our relocated beavers. Now, fast forward a few years, our project was starting to gain kind of regional recognition, particularly with landowners that wish to have beaver issues solved non-lethally. And we started getting calls from all corners of Western Washington and realized that we had a really big capacity issue. So initially, we started reaching out to other sovereign tribes and seeing if they were interested in starting their own relocation programs. We were successful with one tribe, the Cowlitz tribe in southwestern Washington. But at the same time, we didn't want the sort of time-consuming and potentially financial burden of beaver relocation to fall solely on sovereign tribes. And at the same time, we were communicating with several non-tribal groups that really wanted to get involved in this work. So in 2017, we decided to attempt to amend the Washington State Beaver Bill. So we began working with our tribal lobbyists to gather bipartisan support and to incorporate Western Washington into the language of the existing bill. We went and testified in the State House and Senate, and later that year, the bill was successfully passed, which legalized beaver relocation statewide. And as a result of that legislative change, the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife was tasked with creating a pilot program to certify beaver relocators. So for about 2 years, we advised the state in the development of this program. And we're now in our 4th year of co-hosting their annual training, where we supply our technical expertise on the subject to their new permittees. But our kind of final and kind of like programmatic purpose, I guess, of this project is firstly to preclude the lethal management of these animals, but also to place them in vacant areas where they will be respected and tolerated for the innumerable benefits that they're providing to Western Washington's suffering hydrology. So we have 3 main research objectives on this project. When we started, first we wanted to know, is there actually a need for beaver relocation? Beavers are by no means an endangered species in Western Washington, but many salmon are. So we're targeting the Snohomish and Stillaguamish watersheds, which are 2 of the top salmon producing watersheds to Puget Sound. So we wanted to know if and where beavers already existed in these areas. Once we found out where the beavers were going to go, we had to know where they were going to come from. So we had no interest in relocating just any beaver. So we started partnering with local organizations and counties to identify sources of nuisance beavers. And I put air quotes around nuisance because beavers are a native species. They are part of a natural process. But the problem is they're making a big comeback in the lowland areas that are now found to be unnatural human altered systems, and beavers just doing what beavers do, they're getting into trouble. So, and then the final objective is essentially to monitor these sites post-relocation and figure out what benefits these beavers are providing in the areas that we're placing them. So to address that first objective of where the beavers are going to go, we developed a 3-step process for identifying potential relocation sites. And the first part of that is using the Beaver Intrinsic Potential Model, or the BIP. And this was developed by Michael Pollock at NOAA Fisheries. And what this model does is looks at the landscape and uses these watershed scale metrics like stream gradient, valley bottom width, and identifies which stream segments have high suitability for beaver occupancy and dam building. And so it ranks these stream segments from highly suitable to not suitable at all. And then after we've identified those stream segments, we physically go out to these streams and we have a site scorecard, and we further rank those sites for things like water availability, food availability, anything that's going to make a beaver happy and healthy. And then the third step of our site selection is that all of these sites are vetted by United States Forest Service staff to ensure that these relocated beavers won't be coming into conflict with park infrastructure. So the map you see here, this is the Skykomish watershed where we initially started the project. And when we did this exercise in this watershed, we found 91 sites or stream segments that were highly suitable in the model. So we went and physically walked every single one of those streams. And what we found was nearly 75% of those streams were highly suitable for beaver, but unoccupied by beaver. So we have to assume that there's some type of barrier, whether ecological or physical, that's preventing beavers from naturally recolonizing these areas. So we found that there was indeed a need for assisted recolonization of beavers in these areas. And today we've expanded these efforts to 3 different watersheds within our region. So then we started trapping, and again, we're targeting these nuisance beavers, but I really want to emphasize here that we are exclusively targeting beavers that are causing safety issues or not providing ecological benefit. For example, when they're trapped in detention ponds or highway ditches. We're working with local counties in the roadway districts to trap beavers that are plugging culverts and flooding out roads, or working with homeowners that are having flooding on their farms or properties. But first and foremost, we perform a site assessment to basically find out if in-place management or coexistence is possible. We don't want to remove all of the beavers from the lowlands, nor could we possibly ever. But we work with the landowners and do education to tell them the benefits that the beavers have on their property. And so in cases where they go the in-place or coexistence management route, we partner with Beavers Northwest, which is a nonprofit organization that specializes in things like exclusion fencing and pond levelers. But in cases where that's not possible, in an effort to preclude lethal management of these beavers, we decide to relocate them. And we are targeting entire family units or mated pairs. We found over the years that beavers form very tight-knit familial bonds, and they're far more likely to stay where we put them if we relocate them all together. So in order to do that, we temporarily house them during the trapping process at the Tulalip Fish Hatchery, where they have access to running water and temporary lodges, and they're very comfortable as they await the rest of their family members and their relocation. So these are wild animals. They're being returned to wild places. So at all costs, we try to minimize handling and habituation, but we do need to get some information from these beavers as they come into our facility. So each beaver, we take their weight, we determine their gender, we give them an identification ear tag, which helps us identify the individuals while they're under our care, but also help with post-relocation monitoring with the use of game cameras. And we also take a hair sample from these beavers. And just last year, we began working with Washington State University to see if these hair samples could help us using environmental DNA or eDNA technology to not only track the beavers post-relocation, but also to determine if they have the potential to spread disease and aquatic invasives in relocation reaches. And then once the entire family is captured, we load them up into transport cages and truck them up to pre-selected mountain streams. And from there, we get a lot of questions about, well, do they stay where you put them? And on average, I would say we probably calculate around a 45% retention rate at our pre-selected sites, which is really good because beavers move a lot. Within the past 2 years, however, we've had about 75% retention at our relocated sites and the sites that we're actively monitoring. But when beavers do abandon these sites, we're left scratching our heads trying to figure out where they went, because they're really hard to track due to their anatomy and the abrasiveness of their environment, it's really hard to affix GPS transmitters to them. We often see very little sign of predation. So our hope, if not assumption, is that at least a percentage of the beavers that abandon these sites are remaining in these upland areas and are contributing to the genetic diversity of the local beaver populations and continuing to contribute to the climate resilience. So here are some examples of what our post-relocation monitoring looks like. Every year in the fall at all of these sites, we perform GPS and drone surveys of the areas pre and post relocation. And that's in an effort to map the wetted edge of the habitat and how it's changed when beaver dams are constructed at these areas. And these maps here on the screen represents a single year of beaver dam construction at relocation sites. And this equated this particular year to nearly 10.5 acres of increased surface water habitat at this area. So you can imagine how much that translates to over the 8 years that we've been doing this work. And not only that, but of course, the whole purpose of our program is to provide and increase that habitat for fish. But not only that, we're seeing kind of localized explosions of biodiversity in these areas, which is not something that we anticipated. We used game cameras to survey these sites for about a year prior to any relocation, and often don't get too much on those cameras. But after the beavers start manipulating the habitat with dams, we're seeing all shapes and sizes of Washington wildlife using this habitat, which is personally one of my favorite parts of the job. And so I have to end this with a shameless plug. I was recently accepted to the Utah State University Master's Program, where I will be working with Dr. Emily Fairfax, who some of you may be familiar with, and Dr. Julie Young. And I'll be studying the global policies and practices surrounding beaver management and relocation in an effort to create a sort of scientific how-to guide for existing and also future beaver management practitioners. So I put this slide up here in the event that anyone knows anyone in the beaver world that would like to contribute. Feel free to reach out to me at the email address below. And I also, yes, I have it on the next slide as well. And this is just to say thank you to my project team, our collaborators and funders, and to you all for listening today. And let me know if you have any questions.
That was fantastic. That was so hope inspiring and heartwarming. And
oh, good.
Yeah,
I did great.
thank you for sharing that. I mean, just how incredible that you guys started doing this when it was essentially illegal, but you were able to do it under tribal sovereignty, and then able to actually shift the legislation in the state as a whole. I mean, that's just so incredible. Thanks for sharing that, and thanks for the work you're doing.
Of course, thank you.
Are you okay with me sharing your email in the chat here too, so people can just copy and paste it?
Yeah, please. I can throw it in there as well.
Yeah. Excellent. Our next speaker, Sharna Gilmore, is the executive director for the Scott River Watershed Council, a nonprofit located within the Klamath River Basin. Sharna's work focuses heavily on restoration efforts that support process-based riverine function, in particular the use of beaver and beaver mimicry. She's committed to finding solutions to complex social and ecological issues that relate to water in the West, while working to facilitate adaptive management strategies necessary for these types of restoration tools. It's really great to have you on here, Sharna. Thank you for sharing what you guys are doing with the Scott River Watershed Council.
Great.
Yeah,
thank you. I'm like, wow, those two first presentations. And I think what I'm here to speak about is I'm going to take this the big level and all the work that's been done by these amazing presenters today and talk about a watershed that was originally called Beaver Valley. So this is a story about river and beaver, and a story through the eyes of the rodent. This picture, I think, really demonstrates and shows what the valley bottom and the valley that I live in, called Scott Valley now. It's the European name that was given after its first name given for its immense beaver population, Beaver Valley. We are in Northern California. We're part of the beautiful Klamath Basin. Many of you may be hearing about some of the large restoration actions and taking out 4 dams on the main stem. So the pink watershed that you see there highlighted is the Scott, and it's a really important system within the Klamath Basin for coho salmon. And I was really glad to hear Ben talk about that, because I am going to be speaking about the importance of our work as it relates to coho salmon and how we are utilizing beavers and beaver mimicry to try to recolonize and support that species, particularly with the efforts of recolonizing the upper basin in the Klamath. So as talked about earlier, one of the first anthropogenic impacts severely was from this gentleman and his fellow trappers when they came into Beaver Valley and immediately named it Beaver Valley, and then in 1 month took over 2,000 animals. That trapping has persisted over time. And then as the European influence continued, mining, as it has happened in many areas along the West Coast, the Scott River has really been drastically altered by mining activities. Then came water allocations and ranching activities that unfortunately did not understand or appreciate the importance of valuing an ecological component of leaving water in stream. And so we have a water law based on an over allocation of water. And then the climate disaster, which is just exacerbating all the past historic legacy impacts. And so much of the work in the Scott is around this tension. And this tension really lies. So here's another really beautiful valley picture, looking from the north to the south. And here is, it's picturesque, it's beautiful, and it's the same area that not only beavers like, because it's low gradient. Historically, there would have been a lot of food, and those systems have over time, for those anthropogenic impacts that I spoke of earlier, have been reduced to the point where our beaver were nearly extirpated from our system. We have seen, and we believe we are on an upswing and having a rebound in population, and there's many things that might factor to that. But one of the things is trying to increase their food availability by doing some fencing around riparian areas and increasing their ability to forage. This particular system, like the Scott with this low gradient system, is also the area where coho salmon, and the Scott in particular, is a stronghold for one of the most wild and diverse genetic subspecies of the coho salmon, because of the fact that we have no dams on our system. We have some of the highest population numbers in the Klamath River, and it's not a surprise when they evolved with this rodent that also engineers these types of wetlands that they persist on. And then, of course, after the European contact, we then have also occupied this space that now is where we spend, the Scott River Watershed Council spends a tremendous amount of our effort and time trying to just figure out ways that we can coexist with these important species. So what can we, and why do we care for beavers, and what really motivated us? In 2014, we partnered with Dr. Pollock to look at the Scott River and how we could try to support the beaver population. One of the things that we have appreciated since we started our work is that we recognized, and I'm going to start getting some examples of some of that impact of drought that we're seeing on the Scott. And so in 2020, here's a data set that shows that was the 5th driest year on record. This is a water year that is based on an accumulated discharge from our valley. This is an 80-year data set. So in 2020, we had a disastrous water year, as much as the West did. Unfortunately, 2021 also exceeded that and became our 4th driest year on record. But interestingly, and this happened last year, is that we had, we do a lot of monitoring, similar to what Molly was talking about. We monitor all our systems in our project sites. So here's something that was really exciting for us, and we were able to document it and tell a story about what beavers can do really instantaneous when they go to work in our stream systems. So right here, you see this was about September 13th. All of a sudden you see this extreme water increase, nearly 2 feet of surface water elevation. And this was a direct result of a beaver moving in. We've named him Frenchie, but it's just a name that we give all the beaver in French Creek that have gone in and helped our systems really expand and increase our water surface elevation. Another way of looking at this data is through groundwater network wells that we have established. So this is the same area. That dam was built around that September 13th date. And here you see 3 groundwater wells and 1 surface water well that almost instantaneously jumped about 2 feet in their surface water elevations. So obviously this is extremely important. This is extremely dry part of the year, and in trying to take into account the enormity of the drought conditions, the Coho salmon absolutely needed this type of water bump in order to sustain life through the real dry time until the fall rains came. Another way to look at the data here is a cross section of the stream. We've got a water surface elevation that, as you can see through the stream, this data set here, that it just bumped 2 feet almost again overnight, which I think is just a way of empirically looking at the data to tell the story. As was mentioned earlier, there are conflicts that do exist, and we certainly have done our share amount of work in the Scott to try to mitigate for those. Cutting down trees is something that they are famous for, and so we do a fair amount of wrapping of trees. The photo on the right is a beaver deceiver for an irrigation diversion, which is a conflict that obviously we do not like it when ranchers turn to elimination of the beaver, so coexistence, and trying to figure out ways to develop systems and tools that we can help that coexistence within our valley is really important for us. So our work in the Scott, as I mentioned earlier, really persists around the beaver mimicry. So one of the things that we are probably most famous for is beaver dam analog constructions. This is a project site on the Scott River. This Sugar Creek, a site that was first constructed in 2014 with California's first BDA, or beaver dam analog. This is an area where over time we have reared thousands and thousands of juvenile coho salmon before they outmigrate to the ocean. And so one of the things and the messages that I'm hoping to express today and share is that these really highly modified systems can be reconciled, or at least worked with, in ways that can promote ecological services that mimic beaver and beaver beaver benefits. So here is a set of data that came from last year's fish sampling. We had this is a, excuse me, I'm a little nervous here. This is a data set that came from our sampling of Coho salmon. This is showing is that we have extreme growth rates for our juvenile salmon that are reared in these slow water habitats, either in our beaver habitats or our beaver dam analog habitats, which really kind of mirror each other's. The black data set are those that were reared in these habitats, and the orange is our control pools. Just another way of illustrating the benefits of working with beavers and trying to mimic how they influence their environment. So as Molly was talking about, one of the things, and this is probably my most favorite thing too, Molly, is that we just see an immense amount of activity of other wildlife that are enjoying just the activity of dam building within a stream system. So these are different photo traps that we were able to get at one of our dam sites, where this is an analog that we built in 2014. And in 2015, the Beaver have taken over this site and have completely managed it since that time. We are working with UC Davis also to understand what the basic food web changes are, and I can report back. We just published a paper with Nicholas Corline, When Humans Work Like Beavers, Riparian Restoration Enhances Invertebrate Gamma Diversity and Habitat Heterogeneity. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. Heterogeneity. Oh my gosh. Anyways, that was just came out in the Restoration Ecology in March of 2022. So with that, I'm going to also give my email and my website, and feel free if you have any questions that you would like to ask me.
That was fantastic. I mean, I just love, between all of our speakers here, we've got so much covered. How incredible to see those lifts in the stream channel elevation. You just think about, being on the landscape and in these areas, the difference between a little trickling, drying up creek and something that actually has water, has habitat, has life, it's holding water on the banks of each side. Awesome presentation and awesome work. And I'm just so in awe of all of you guys painting such a clear picture on what we need to do, how we can do it, how we got here in the first place. And that leads us to our next speaker, a man who needs a scant an introduction, but also someone who helped coordinate this panel, Brock Doleman. He's the co-founder of Occidental Arts and Ecology Center. I'll drop that link in the chat here as well, in 1994, and he co-directs the Water Institute's Bringing Back the Beaver campaign. He's a wildlife biologist and watershed ecologist who's been actively promoting beaver in California since the early 2000s. He's co-authored another number of papers. He's done a lot of incredible things. Definitely look more into the Occidental Arts and Ecology and their campaign to bring back the beaver. And without further ado, take it away, Brock.
Great. Well, thank you, Zach and Raleigh, for hosting this. And wow, so impressed to be here with Ben, Molly, and Sharna. It's a big beaver dams but I'm going to add another beaver dam with the colony here. And so, yes, my name is Brock Doleman, and I work at the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center, and I co-direct the Water Institute with Kate Lundquist and our Bring Back the Beaver campaign. So I'm going to get right into that. And let's see, I have to stop share for a second here, because I don't know why I did this the last time, but it somehow seems to like to do that. So, all righty, sorry about that. Well, my hope is I have a super dense slideshow here for you all, and I'm gonna, thankfully, Ben, Molly, and Sharna have introduced and contextualized and informed us on a bunch of items that I'm gonna help us basically summarize. And so, but I did really want to start off with welcome to Planet Water, people, because it's the only place in the known universe where water is life. And I wish Elon Musk the best of luck on Mars and the moon, but I ain't going with him. So no beavers up on Mars, and shouldn't be. And I really, want to acknowledge, I think that where water is life here on this planet, and really I have for 20 plus years now promoted this idea of thinking like a watershed, this idea of basins of relations, and really our relationship to rethink from ridge to river to reef for a reverential and resilient rehydration revolution retrofit, and how beaver fits within that is a component of this integrated holistic solution. And for several decades, I've been engaged in promoting this idea, what I call conservation hydrology, this mantra that Ben spoke of earlier, the slow it, spread it, sink it, store it, share it, and that idea of our reconnection with the water cycle. And I really honor Luna Leopold's quote here, that the health of our waters is the principal measure of how we live on the land. And I would say that the health of our beaver is the principal measure of how they're living in the water as well. And so, yes, beaver, we've been hearing a bunch about them. Today, I'm focused on the North American beaver, Castor canadensis. Ben did mention there is a second species of beaver, Castor fiber, that is the Eurasian beaver as well. And I just want to acknowledge that in Sonoma County, we are dwell in the unceded territory of the Southern Pomo and Coast Miwok peoples, and a lot of work a number of us have done, have also found names for beaver in a number of other California Native tribes. And so just acknowledging the First Nations people and their relationship with beaver, which I so appreciate Ben's piece on that, and also obviously with the Tulalip tribe and Molly's work there. So yeah, we started, Kate and I, this Bring Back the Beaver campaign about 15 years ago, really intentionally focused wise, if you will, 10 years ago. And it's got education and outreach, citizen science, research and demonstration, and a lot of policy change. And again, just a quickie on summarizing what Ben talked about at the continental scale is in California, what we call the fur rush really showed up here with the Russians along our coast in the 1780s. And then we got the mountain men types that had to trap for beaver because it was learned from Ben. Many of those indigenous tribes in the West had taboos against killing beaver because they understood how important they were. So by 1911, it was estimated in California that we had less than 1,000 beaver. And they were just along the Colorado in the Central Valley of the Sacramento, San Joaquin, the Delta, and up in the Klamath Basin. And so that a group of us a decade ago actually co-authored a whole series of papers in the California Department of Fish and Game Journal on looking at and documenting, chronicling the historic range of beaver, primarily looking at Sierra Nevada and also in the coastal parts of California, and some other interesting novel evidence where James and Landman paper in 2012 actually carbon dated beaver wood 4,500 feet higher than where beaver were thought to be native, and found a 1,200-year-old beaver dam, by the way. And yes, beavers were parachuted to reintroduce them. There's the famous video on YouTube of Idaho in 1948 doing this. And then there's also in 1950, California actually did this. And so that's all really fun. But what I like about this poster in California is at the bottom, it says that beaver dams in the mountains save water for fish, wildlife, and agriculture. And so folks back in the day by 1950, they really got that. And unfortunately, post 1950, a lot of things turned, and that's a longer story. As Ben mentioned and others, beavers are a keystone species. Their presence in the modifications of landscape disproportionately benefit and increase the carrying capacity and fecundity of that landscape to support other life forms beyond just themselves and processes. And this is just a wonderful paper that a number of our Castro colleagues, if you will, who work in the Sierra Nevada, have been doing explicit studies looking at both the endangered willow flycatcher and also with song sparrows, and directly correlating the presence of beaver on the landscape and the water that they bring with them in behind their dams, and the increase in both willow flycatcher and song sparrow, which is really cool. And then beavers also, as we've been learning about, they increase the water quality, water quantity, they're sequestering nutrients, they're sequestering carbon, they're building wetland soils. Wonderful study by Sarah Muskoff in 2007, looking at phosphorus removal into Lake Tahoe, which we want to keep Tahoe blue, but we really want beavers to help us doing that. And so, and then also just this whole piece, especially in what Ben really described, these extremes between drought and deluge, and how beavers act like shock absorbers and buffers to hold the flow and delay the release, and then augment stream flow as basically, is it really that we live in a water scarce area? Do we live in a storage scarce area? And that slow it, spread it, sink it, store it, share it, and how beavers play in that space. And then just another image, because we're now collecting many more images of burned out whole watersheds, and then these little emerald pieces of incredible wetted beaver habitat that become these critical refugia for wildlife fleeing the fire. And so this is one that was up on the Sprague River in the 2021 bootleg fire. Ben showed us one up in Idaho recently. And so yes, Dr. Emily Fairfax has recoined this idea of Smokey the Beaver and actually published a peer-reviewed paper on it, which I highly recommend people have a look at. And then some work by folks by Carol Evans, who was with the Bureau of Land Management in the Elko District, working with ranchers up in Carlin, Nevada. And imagine this creek here, Susie Creek, in 1992. It's incised, it's dewatered, it's dehydrated, it's degraded, it's desiccated. It's the classic overgraze scenario. And the ranchers just took the cows off in the hot season to give the vegetation a break. And so from this period of 92 to 99, the system started slowly coming back, and then the beavers showed up. And then actually then by 2012 here, you see this valley bottom being reagraded, wetted, greened up. And if you see that YouTube video, the new film, Creating Miracles in the Desert, they've got footage that's only a few years old. And this system's gotten just, I mean, the water retention landscape benefits in an area of the high Great Basin desert where you get maybe 2 to 6 inches of rain. This is an incredible oasis, and the beaver are doing it for free and better and no permits needed. And so we fight incision with incisors, and we're sinking our teeth into this issue, and we're supporting our iron-toothed beaver buddies to get her done. And, you know, sometimes you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. And so that may mean you might have to step up and really think about this and get clear about what is beaver restoration and how do we engage in low-tech process-based ways and with them. And so these 2 documents I would highly recommend to anyone who's engaging in this kind of work here. And then again, and Sharna mentioned some of this, there's a whole, if we want to keep beavers on the landscape, and Molly mentions as well, they're a bit persnickety on the landscape. And so there are times that a culvert is just a perfect dam with just a small hole and it's really easy to plug up. So there are non-lethal coexistence strategies to engage with keeping the beaver on the land, getting the benefits of the beaver, while also managing the infrastructure and the land use that humans are accustomed to. So there's ways to protect culverts with these trapezoidal channels. You can wrap trees. On the left is a color matched sand paint that folks at Keep Tahoe Wild, Sierra Wildlife Coalition, did up in Taylor Creek, so that the sand paint dissuades the beaver from chewing on the trees, although they don't look caged. It's amazing. And then there's a whole world of, I know we're into water retention landscapes, we want to keep as much water on the land as possible, but there are times where we want to have a relationship between how much water we can keep on the land and how much flooding we don't want to have on the land. And so these ideas or these processes of flow control devices, pond levelers, there's a number of names for them, and you can see the drawing below where you've got a cage upstream that where the inlet of a flexible pipe is, that then goes over top of the dam and discharges below the dam. And then you can excavate into the beaver dam to the depth you want to notch it to put the pipe in, so that you can retain as much water as you can for the beavers, but reduce the inundation for whatever the impact is. And we're looking for the sweet spot in between. It's the Goldilocks opportunity, not too wet, not too dry. It's the Goldilocks beaver right in the middle. And we've been working a lot on this with Swiftwater Design as well. And you can see the 2 images in the left and the right. This was a Caltrans project down in Prunedale in Central Coast, California, where the beavers showed up, and look at that amazing wetted area. It was providing critical habitat for red-legged frog and pond turtle actually, but it was inundating the roadbed. And so Caltrans, the state transportation agency, hired us and Swiftwater Design, Kevin Swift, to put in a flow control device. And it's functioned perfectly since, and the turtles and the birds are happy ever since. We're also working in the Central Valley, where we have really low gradient systems. We have duck clubs, we have rice paddies, we've got wildlife refuges, and they've got these concrete weirs, and the beavers really love to plug them up. So this is a modified flow control device, but it's got this cool metal flange that slides into the concrete weir, so that if the beaver don't plug it up, but we still allow the flows to be managed. And so this is about $1,000 worth of toys, custom made. And then the ranch manager where we put this on, 6 months later said, he was spending an hour a day at that site cleaning out stuff to keep the water flowing. And since we put it in, he has not spent 1 hour working on this. So that's 1 hour a day times 6 months of labor that could be used for something else, plus a workers' comp claim that he doesn't need to fix his lower back from hauling out all that wet material, which is why we call it the Beaver Back Saver. And absolutely, relocation is part of the beaver management portfolio. At some point, if you can't live with the beavers you got, which we prefer to live with them where we are and coexist with them, then relocation is an option. And I think Molly really well articulated that really well. And I'm going to mention some stuff at the end of the show about new opportunities with the state. And we look forward to inviting Molly to come to California to bring the Beaver Relocator certification training to us. Wanted to show a couple big projects, and this one is the Placer Land Trust and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with Swiftwater Designs, called the Doty Ravine Project. We're in the Sacramento Valley on the dry side of the low valley near the foothills, near Auburn, if people know that area, Lincoln. And so in the upper left, you can see the original pre-project in 14 or so. It's a single threaded narrow channel where the red lines are. There are levees maintaining the channel. And basically, Placer Land Trust had been killing the beavers for many years, and they asked Fish and Wildlife to help them. And Fish and Wildlife said, look, we'll bring some expertise here, but y'all have to have a beaver peace treaty and stop killing beavers. This is Damian Ciotti's primary work and Jared McKee with US Fish and Wildlife Service. So they said, stop killing beavers. We're going to use a little bit of diesel beaver energy with some big yellow toys. And we're going to knock out strategically bits and pieces of this levee to allow that channel to reconnect with its floodplain. We're going to reinforce existing beaver dams by pinning them. And then they're also going to do BDAs and actually increase the possibility for beavers to be there. And so if you really look at that area, imagine it went from that little thin ribbon to only within 5 to 6 years later, for $58,000, they increased the wetted area by 1,000%. And now it is a full tilt class 5 double black diamond beaver swamp. And it is seriously chest high through there, where it was dry as a bone star thistle over grazed compacted land. And it's all basically beaver peace treaty, strategic levee removal, and then reinforcing dams and BDAs, and then let the beavers do what they want to do. And the amount of water and wildlife here is incredible. This process is happening in the Eel River watershed, South Fork Eel, near the town of Willits, as part of another project that Caltrans was doing in collaboration with the Mendocino Resource Conservation District. They began working with the beavers in Outlet Creek, allowing the beavers to be better beavers, engaging with them, and you can see a group of us on tour, knee deep again in wetted area. Lots at work, and thank you to Scott River Watershed Council and all of bringing the BDAs to California. And since then, folks have really taken off with it. And so the Yurok tribe in Lower Klamath, the Maidu Summit Consortium in the North Fork Feather River system in their valley called Tasman Koyom, up in Childs Meadow near Lassen, folks are all over doing BDAs and then ultimately hoping that beavers will take them over. And so we, Kate and I, have been deep into the work of beavers, and we're really focused on salmonid streams, we're mountain meadows, riparian rangelands, the Central Valley and urban areas. We've got projects all over the place, collaborating with many folks. We're especially fond of collaborating with tribal communities, and we're currently working with the Maidu Summit Consortium and also with the Tule River tribe on this work. And I did want to let folks know that there's a brand new California process-based network that just launched about a month ago. Look us up on the web. Please join us if you would like. Other people, I guess, out of state can also join. And we're getting into this collaboration around, it's not that we're against yellow toys. There are times to use the big yellow toys, but what does it look like to really think about using process and low carbon options and engaging with the verb of flow and beaver instead of the noun of big yellow toys. And I just had to put this up today. This came out in Grist today, hot off the presses, and you got to watch the video. This is a super perfect video. It's going to summarize the whole talk today. I love this. And then a group of us have been involved in pushing policy for a decade plus. This is a crazy banner of a whole logo soup of about almost 100 organizations that Kate and I, with Jennifer Fearing of Fearless Advocacy, brought together to submit to the state of California for their 30 by 30 process and their nature-based climate solutions and climate smart strategy about employing beavers. And so Wade Crowfoot, the Secretary of the Natural Resources Agency, now has recently said on a webinar, full employment for beavers in California. And what's really exciting is that we've been working with the Department of Fish and Wildlife for a decade now, and I can say that it's not been all so happy. And yet we were really excited on April 7th on International Beaver Day, when on their Facebook page, they put this amazing celebration of beaver and honoring that they're native and that all the cool stuff they do. But what we're really most excited about is actually this, which is hopefully in a week, the legislature of California will approve Governor Newsom's proposed budget. And in that budget, he has a dedicated line there, which, as you can see here, is going to dedicate funding for 5 permanent positions to create a brand new, never before in the state of California, beaver management program. We're going to have 5 permanent staff. They're going to have trucks. We're going to have all the toys. We're going to get to talk about relocation and coexistence. And we are beyond excited. So cross your fingers and hope that in a week, the legislature approves that line item in the budget. And then at some point, I just want to ask you all, are you part of the solution or part of the precipitate? Because when you get behind the beaver bug and you get eager about this stuff, you can precipitate the change that's needed. And that really ultimately leads me to this whole sense of how do we adapt our water footprint in a regenerative and rehydrative, receiving, retaining, releasing, and recharging reverential retrofit when we combine forces with none other than our mighty eager beavers. And so we've got a booklet, Beaver in California, Creating Culture of Stewardship, you can find online. There's a California Beaver Summit we did last year that's got all the videos on that. If you want to go look at that, amazing talks that are all on YouTube. And then I just want to leave you with, we can do it, right? Yes, we can, because it's canadensis. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing right there.
Oh,
Oh,
man,
that was
so much
awesome.
poetry in there. That's great.
Yeah, that was fantastic. That was incredible. Thank you for sharing that. Brock, I was trying to find the process-based network you mentioned. I wonder if you could drop that into the chat for people. I couldn't find the
Sure.
link.
I can do that. Yeah, while we're doing Q&A, I can load up the chat.
Awesome. I'm sure people will definitely be interested in joining that. I know I myself am as well. Also dropping in the link, the Beaver Summit that Brock mentioned for you guys who want to dig deeper into this. Yeah, oh my God, my mind is blown. That was incredible. Thank you, all of you. I want to allow, if any of you want to provide some brief comment to any of the other presentations, give, maybe 5 or 10 minutes for that. And then people can start gearing up their questions. We already have a lot in the question and answer that we'll start going through. And for people who want to ask their question with their voice, you can use the raise hand feature. And we can ask you to unmute to ask your question.
Yeah, it's always nice doing that, especially if you typed in your question, you raise your hand, that just gives like this allows people to meet you. So I really encourage everybody, if you asked a Q&A question, raise your hand because we'd love to hear your voice.
Any immediate thoughts that come up that you guys want to add, or should we get right into the questions from the audience?
I would just add that for me, I think that I probably first spoke to Molly, Brock, and Sharna in 2017 when I was working on my book, and it's just such a thrill and a joy to see how much their projects have evolved and advanced over the years. How much incredible documentation Molly and Sharna have, how much amazing work Brock and Kate and the rest of the Occidental group have made on changing the policy conversation around these animals. So it's just, extraordinary to me. I mean, I feel like compared to these guys, I'm a bit of a newcomer to the beaver scene, but it's just been such a joy to watch this cause evolve. It feels like, one of the fastest moving, most progressive, most hopeful ecological causes out there, and it's just really incredibly exciting to be part of this movement.
Yeah, I would say briefly is just, this gives so much hope because a lot of people are out there like, oh, we're all doomed. California's going to burn to a crisp. The whole West is gone. The forests are gone. And yet we're areas where the beaver come back, the hope comes back, the water comes back, the ecosystems and the salmon come back. And it's so beautiful to see that. And it's the connection to these animals. Like they are the spirits of water. And so I'm really grateful that you guys everyone here has put so much time and energy and passion in their lives to helping this cause. So thank you.
Yeah, one of the themes I noticed here is that, we often don't appreciate our rodents. And in a way, they're such vital organisms. I'm reminded of in Australia, when these bushfires come through, wombats dig these holes in the ground. And usually wombats are very territorial. They'll kill anything that comes into their den. But during the fires, they let all of the animals come into their den as refuge for the fires. It's these rodents providing for their ecosystem. Same thing is happening with the beavers in our fires in the American West. They're providing this vital refuge for the other animals and other organisms. Then you even go back to like the Ojibwe creation story, and it was muskrat who swam down and pulled up the first bit of earth to put it on Turtle's back to make Turtle Island. So I think it's a really good point that we can start to really appreciate our rodent relatives.
I think you guys should do a follow-up webinar about prairie dogs, you know, whose burrows are just so crucial as sort of conduits for water infiltration, right? I mean, prairie dogs are, you know, after beavers, probably the most hydrologically influential rodent. So yeah, I would love to see more rodent hydrology.
There's a wonderful saying, it's Navajo or Hopi, that when the prairie dogs are gone, there'll be nobody to cry for the rain. And there's some understanding. And in fact, Bill Mollison, one of the co-founders of permaculture, acknowledged that the Pseudomonas syringae, which are these ice nuclei bacteria with low pressures, the land exhales out of the prairie dog towns and pushes those ice nuclei up in the front of the storm front to increase the capacity for rain clouds to happen. So yeah, bring on the all those critters.
All right, well, let's get to some amazing questions here. All right, so who has raised their hand? About 4 folks. Let's try to find their question. Casey, Tony. Okay, let's go with Tony first. So Tony, I'm gonna unmute you. Let's have you chat here. Hey there, Tony.
Hi. Yeah, I'm from Cuyahoga territory in the Finger Lakes of New York, and I'm interested. I'm brand new to this, the whole beaver movement, and so I'd like to know what's going on in the northeast of Turtle Island about restoring the beaver.
Cool, thank you. Any y'all have any insight on Northeast beaver restoration?
I would just say that I think it's this next week. There's actually Beaver Con, which is a whole conference about beaver that's in this case focused on the East Coast, although I think people from all over the country and in fact Europe will be attending Beaver Con. If you look that up, it's the parallel to the West Coast version in Oregon of State of the Beaver Conference. And so I think there's going to be a whole lot of eager beaver believers that come out of the East Coast, and I'm sure that there'll be folks that are related to the Finger Lakes region and other parts of New York. I mean, you all have such a different relationship to water than those of us in the arid West, and so it's.
Oh, yeah.
But nonetheless, Mike Callahan with Beaver Solutions in Massachusetts would be someone you could really talk to, because he knows kind of everybody and everything happening, all things beaver in the Northeast.
Thank you.
Yeah, they dropped some good resources in the chat. So there's beavercon.org and the Beaver Institute have been dropped there for it's Massachusetts. It'd be really cool to be at BeaverCon. That'd be so fun. All right, so a question from Jody. I'm gonna unmute her.
BeaverCon is like our Super Bowl.
Oh, I can only imagine. Hey there, Jody.
Actually, I'm a guy.
Oh, sorry.
No problem. No problem. I'm good with that. I'm used to it. My question was, could the speakers talk a little bit more about how beavers' activities can especially mitigate the effects of heavy rains and flooding?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. In fact, some of our previous funding has come from floodwater control districts. But essentially, when the beavers build these dams, one, they're not only capturing surface water, but the weight of that surface water infiltrates the groundwater and creates so much more water storage on the landscape. And then what beavers also do is reconnect historic floodplain and channels that may have been devoid of water pre-beaver impact. And so they're really just creating a landscape that is more able to accommodate more water, and those dams slow the flow of those kind of, well, in the West, we have these really intense winter storms that create this flash flooding, and the beaver dams capture and store all that excess water.
Right. Yeah, that's helpful. I guess I had thought of beaver dams as more or less constant level pools, so that helps a lot. It spreads it out even more into the canals and normally dry, maybe tributary channels.
I think I'll just add to that, Molly. Jody, I think the other thing that's really important about flooding is And what beaver dams do is it can take the energy out of that water. So if you're depending on depending on the storm system and the channel in which it's traveling in, it has a really destructive nature to it when it's like that. So beaver dams or beaver dam analogs tend to just, when it slows that water down, it takes its force out of it. So a lot of the damaging parts of a storm system can be mitigated by just that one action of just slowing it down a bit and taking some of the snort out of the system.
Sure, that's great. Thanks.
And I just popped, there's the best research, or some of the best research on the beaver flood mitigation connection has come out of England, University of Exeter. I just popped one of their papers in the chat too, because again, that's the UK is a rainy place where beavers are being reintroduced largely for their flood attenuation benefits.
Wow. Thank you all.
Cool, appreciate your question, Jody. Right. So next person we got here, I'm gonna let's see, Paul Crapful. I think that'd be a cool question about salmon. Hey there, Paul.
Hello. Hello. I got a question from Molly. I might have missed it. You were saying that the whole beaver thing was the target species was the salmon, and I don't know if you ever talked about what effect, and researching as the project has expanded, what effect has it had on the salmon?
Yes, and I do apologize. This was a very condensed version of the work that we do, given the time allotment. But yes, I will be the first to admit that we have not done actual scientific research on the salmon increases in our beaver ponds. There's tons of empirical evidence that we've observed of spawning salmon returning to these once incised closed canopy riparian zone areas that the beavers have improved. We have done a fair amount of hydrological monitoring in the past, looking at stream temperature, stream speed, and groundwater storage. So we can make some kind of surface level inferences from the hydrologic impacts on the salmon, but we are currently in the process of trying to obtain some grant funding to ramp up our salmon monitoring so that we can have results on that in the next few years.
Okay, thank you.
Cool, appreciate your question, Paul. All right. Hey, Yvonne, do you mind raising your hand? You have some really cool questions. I'd love to have you on there, but okay, Yvonne has raised her hand. Hey, Yvonne.
Hi everybody. Thank you so much. This was so cool. I have some I had a bunch of questions. This one probably would be interesting for more people who are here, so I'll ask it. Are there any challenges to introducing beavers on the landscape related to water rights that people hold and how the beavers may alter flow regimes of water, ways that people draw water from? I'm just wondering what kind of challenges there are there, if there are any.
I'll offer up something, and I'm sure Molly and Sharna have. There's the old Mark Twain saying, "Whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting" over in California, and the perception by a number of downstream users of where beaver activity and impoundment beaver ponds is active. There is often an assertion that the beaver are stealing their water, and there's a long history of folks coming upstream, breaking out beaver dams, killing beavers on both sides of the Sierras and the foothills, especially on the east side of the Sierras. Actually, the Walker watersheds and the Carson are very famous for this behavior. Nevada ranchers coming up to do that. And I think what we see, and again with a number of peer-reviewed papers as well, is that those beaver ponds that are slowing and spreading and sinking and storing and sharing that water are elongating the presence of water on the landscape and attenuating the hydrograph, so that it's about the timing of flow. Those folks may be used to getting a bigger pulse earlier than maybe they had before, but once that system's full up, the amount of water available over time appears to increasingly be more available. And I think, as Ben mentioned, especially in our mountains where we have we're increasingly having less snow and more rain, we need those shock absorbers even more so that water doesn't run away too quick, and then we're high and dry in the summer. So I think there's more science needed, more research, and ultimately the water rights world in California is also going to need to come on board. But I have heard folks from our state water board assert that beaver are native, and their interaction in the creek is thus a native part of the system. It's a natural part of the system, and therefore they are those water rights are shall we say, the most senior water rights of all. They precede even the hominids. So their water rights are RITES. They have the rights to water. And so I think there's a recognition that folks are going to have to learn how to work with the timing and appreciate the beaver for the extra water they are given, actually.
Yeah, to add on to that, I think we're in this political climate where we're constantly prioritizing downstream flow, and we need to start prioritizing extending that flow, not just through the immediate year, but between years, year to year. Because, I see with our work very much the same thing. There might be a short-term loss that first year, but then it's an increase year after year once the work is in place. So we just need to open up our time scale perspective, especially with these water rights issues, to really see the full picture.
Great. Well, I appreciate your questions, Yvonne. Those are real good.
There's one here that I'd love to get to, maybe even a little bit selfishly, from Edward Cutler. He's asking you guys, we need a proper movie documentary film made about beavers based on all your work and research. Has anyone approached any of you guys about a film? And if not, I would say we would definitely be interested in creating some kind of water story micro documentary around this, because this is definitely a story that needs to get out there.
Yeah, the film does certainly exist. It's called The Beaver Believers by Sarah Koenigsberg, who's based in Eastern Washington. It's just a wonderful documentary about the beaver movement. But certainly there are never enough great beaver documentaries. So there's absolutely room for more. And I mean, just so many new projects springing up all the time that that my book or Sarah's film didn't encapsulate. So there's I think that there should be a new beaver documentary every few years. That makes sense to me.
This is another shameless plug, I guess. I was going to mention the Beaver Believers documentary. That's kind of the cream of the crop. We haven't contributed to any documentaries per se, but we've been doing a lot of filming for TV shows in the past couple of years. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Wildlife Nation with Jeff Corwin. That's a new show on ABC every Sunday. And we did an episode with them that aired a couple of weeks ago. I'm not sure if that's streamable yet, but it will be in the near future. And we're also doing some filming with Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom coming this summer. So stay tuned for that. But those are just some kind of visual resources where you can learn more about at least our work. But I know that they'll be interviewing many other people in the beaver world as well.
Nice. I'm getting some, I kind of selfishly want to go to hear more about beavers in Colorado, because that's my homeland. And it's sad seeing the effects of wildfire smashing through, places where my parents live in Evergreen and Boulder, and just seeing the potential that beavers have to protect and even restore areas where people kind of fear for their existence because of wildfire. Marion, you had a question about Colorado, so I'm going to unmute you. Would love to hear more about your questions about this recent beaver in Colorado. Hey there.
Since we have a lot of problems with water and a lot of problems with fire, I'm interested if we are as aggressively using beavers to help us in this effort here in Colorado. I don't know if you guys professionally know folks who are working hard on this, because of course we do a lot of work in wildfire mitigation and drought mitigation. So
yeah, I just moved to Colorado recently, so I can.
Oh, welcome.
Thanks a lot. I've been immersing myself in the local beaver scene. But I put a link to the Colorado Beaver Working Group in the chat.
Cool.
Which is
Great.
open to everybody, and you'd be welcome to join. A few people whose work I would highlight. Aaron Hall with Defenders of Wildlife has done a lot of great advocacy and has also created sort of like a citizen science app for documenting beaver presence called iBeaver. Here in the Arkansas Valley, where I live, Mark Beardsley from the company Ecometrics does a lot of fantastic kind of, the sort of beaver dam analog work that Sharna and Brock talked about. So, he's doing a lot of process-based beaver related restoration in, in South Park and other places. And he's, certainly a beaver believer. And then Sherry Tippie is sort of like one of the grandmothers of the beaver movement. She's a beaver relocator who who's probably even more beavers than Molly, if that's possible. She's still not as active as she was, but she's still around and is a great resource as well. So certainly it's not quite the beaver movement in Colorado. I moved down there from Washington, which really has, really thanks
Yes.
to the has, the best beaver politics and policies in the country. So, Colorado isn't at Washington's stage yet, but it's getting there. There's a lot of people working on this, but I would encourage you to join that working group that I linked to in the chat, because
Thank you so much. And just a little side note on the prairie dog, because of course I'm here in Boulder, and we have a huge hate and love for prairie dogs, and those two groups are constantly at odds with each other. But I don't think anyone understands what prairie dogs do for groundwater retention. So where would I learn more about that?
I think that Alice Outwater's book, which is just called Water, she has a nice prairie dog chapter, I think.
Outwater?
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you.
Alice Outwater.
Because I'd like to maybe bring that to Boulder and to our policymakers. Thank you.
How can anybody be against the prairie dogs right around Pearl Street? You love it. There's like, oh, there are friends right there. It's just like they should be the mascots of Boulder, seriously.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're right, but it's pretty ridiculous how much negative press they get. Also,
Yeah.
It's just
people gotta learn.
It's because people just don't understand nature. They don't understand farming. They don't understand plants, water, fire. We're just so out. There's a few of you who are like dedicated to this, and I do a lot of work in farming. I have a nonprofit advocating for farmers. So of course they're very distressed also about the prairie dogs and what it does to fields. And I think we need to understand that they bring us a lot of good things too.
Yeah, damn right. Well, I appreciate you, Maren. Thanks so much for bringing your questions.
Thank you.
See you later.
And along those same lines, Brock, I know a number of people are asking, how do they keep up with this pending legislation? And I'd add to that, if people want to make their voices heard, if they want to write letters, how can they get connected to do so?
Yeah, thanks. So unlike what Molly and those folks in Washington did, where they actually did engage in a legislative process around the beaver piece, we in California, for various reasons, really looked at it, engaged with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and our Fish and Game Commission, and felt like that there's enough existing authority with that agency that we went through a policy guidance process and then through the governor, so the executive branch, to then put this proposal forward to fund the process of this new beaver management program with the funded staff. So it's technically not a legislative process at this point. Maybe there's a California beaver bill in our future, but we all felt like we could get what we wanted done, or at least attempted to, without a legislative process. So different ways in our democracy to get out this work. And then as far as when, hopefully on June 15th, if the legislature actually approves the governor's budget, that's where the legislature comes in, is they're just approving the budget overall because they have the purse strings, right? So assuming they're going to pony up out of the purse strings for a little beaver management plan, all of you send us an email. Kate and I and others will certainly wave that beaver flag loud and proud on the top of the hill when that happens. So you'll hear in a week, hopefully.
Excellent. Really hoping that that all falls through or falls into place. Just, yeah, I love to see also these different aspects and ways to accomplish these goals, because it's what we need right now. We need to pursue all the options that we have, find the pathways of least resistance that we can pursue, and work on pushing them forward. So thank you all who are here for doing that. Do you want to call on another person?
Yeah. So I was
Emily,
just
or should we-
distracted. I wanted to like, oh, I got this beaver dam footage in my backyard. I wanted to share that, but instead, let's answer some questions first. All right. Let's see. How about Casey? You've had your hand raised for a while. All right. Hey there, Casey.
Hi, so I'm calling from Montana. And first off, it's just so cool to see all those pictures and all the work y'all are doing and the successes. Here, in my experience in Montana, the word beaver is a bad word. It's taboo. It's hard to, it's just so far removed from so much of this right now. And every environmental quality council meeting, they give the fire reports, the drought reports for Montana, how bad things are looking. This year is expected to be another really bad year for fires and droughts, but never, ever is there any mention of beaver. And I know I feel like a broken record. And so I'm trying to find out, because here in Montana, beaver can be trapped with the purchase of a $28 trapping license. They can be trapped unlimited, unreported for 5.5 to 9 months out of the year, with most of the state being the 9 months. And that's for recreational purposes. Outside the season, a landowner can just say, oh, I think some beaver is going to dam up my irrigation, and they can get a permit. Some of you have clearly been so successful. How do we get this, front and center? How do we get the importance and the need for beaver communicated to the powers that be? What are some, I guess I'm just looking for some ideas and more help. Ben can attest to what went on in Beaver Creek Park. They just refused. And, they just continue to trap the beaver rather than look at other options and the worth that is offered. And, one of the largest county parks in the country. So thank you.
Well, like
Appreciate your question.
Colorado, Montana also has a beaver working group. And those folks have been really active and have been pushing hard, connected through the National Wildlife Federation there. And I have all the sympathies with you about your sense about Montana and the beaver haters. California, I can run through the exact same list. There's no trapping season was open in 38 of our counties, no bag limit, no regulation. It's so, I will let you know, just do the work, change the hearts, find the crossover people, the ranchers that get it, the other land use folks that value water more than a dry creek, and their beaver, water will trump beaver hatred in a dry landscape, I guarantee you. And the fire piece as well. And there's a policy piece, and there's still some recalcitrant folks, but I think just align yourself with your Beaver Believers and slog away, and make sure to have drinks at the pub afterwards, just to call yourself in the early years, because
It's forming those relationships. Like you said, it took 10 years. So hopefully, yes, keeping at it. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just add, over the 8 years that I've been doing this, there's been a major perception shift in the way beavers are thought about, particularly in Western Washington, since we started doing this work. And that didn't come easily. We had to shift a lot of our programmatic function over to focusing on education and outreach, because we were just so focused on trapping the beavers, moving the beavers, and we wanted to see the on the ground benefits. But if no one knew what we were doing and seeing the before and after photos, there's no reason for them to care, especially if they don't know if it's being successful. So it's really engaging with groups like this, or all of the resources that the other panelists have put in the chat. Those are really good resources to at least get the conversation started.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess I would only add that if you can find opportunities in these really desperate times, the drought for us in 2014 actually provided us the mechanism to what we call it now. We came out of the closet. Before that, we were really cautious about talking about beaver in a way that we didn't want to have our community feel threatened. And so, you know, our area is probably similar to Montana. We were really affected by the spotted owl. And so we were really concerned of trying not to make the beaver that next threat to them. And that 2014 drought, which now it's been 15, 18, 20, 21, 22, did provide an opportunity, because where we saw water and where we had water, we could talk about water, we had beaver. And all of a sudden that threat, that fear. And then we were really never trying to say that depredation was off the table. We really wanted to offer the tools to wrapping and beaver deceivers and pond levelers, so that we could acknowledge that, yes, they're pesky, you know, really problematic at times, but let us help you with that, because here's why. And that did seem, and we've had a major, like Molly just said, a cultural shift in our valley, which was super conservative, and really, yeah, beavers, you know, brought up a huge amount of emotional response. But we don't see that anymore. I go into stores now and they're like, "Oh, you're the beaver lady." You know, 10 years ago, I would have mortified. I would have just crawled into the freezer. I just would have. But so, yeah, look for the opportunities. These desperate times do present actually some really valuable things that I think we can leverage.
Great. Thank you.
Good luck, because we've been there, but you'll get there. Perseverance is important.
We're working on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Casey. Appreciate
There's
it.
another question along these same lines too. You guys have really answered part of it already, but I wonder if we could just dive a little bit deeper. And I think a lot of people are feeling this, you know, they hear this story, they want to help, they're trying to figure out how they can help. Where do you guys see the largest barriers to increasing the pace and scale of this work, particularly in the American West? Is it this public awareness and education? Is it funding? Is it policy? Is it all of the above? If people are going to put their focus and effort on one area, what's the biggest barrier to help start removing?
Well, I'll go ahead, Ben.
Oh, no. Yeah, please, Sharna.
Well, I'll just take it from my little microcosm in the sky. Our limiting factor, I believe, because we've gotten through some of that social things that we were just talking about, our system is really impaired. And so one of the things that we really struggle with are places where we know beaver should be, but we either don't have, mainly I think it's driven by food resources. And so we have a really outcompeting blackberry issue that's now, we fenced off a lot of our riparian areas in the early 2000s, which was great, but then there was no land management practices to address this really aggressive infiltration and over, you know, it just takes over. So that seems to be one of our limiting factors. It's no longer the social issue. We think it's more of a biological and sometimes physical issue.
I mean, yeah, that's really interesting, Sharna. The blackberry thing is something I hadn't thought about or heard about. I mean, to me, you know, the thing that holds back beaver recovery writ large is just coexistence. You know, and it's, I mean, there are just so many places around the country where, you know, various sort of like local governments, town councils, you know, municipalities, county commissions just have these very long-standing trapping arrangements to eliminate every single beaver that plugs up a culvert. And, you know, like, I think that in a lot of cases, you know, the people who sign off on these long-standing trapping arrangements don't even know they exist. You know, it's just sort of like a line item in a budget that's signed every single year. You know, and I mean, Brock has done a lot of work to change that in California, of course. But, you know, I mean, every year, the Department of Agriculture, Wildlife Services kills 20,000 beavers. It's the federal government, you know, and certainly private nuisance trappers are killing tens, if not hundreds of thousands more. You know, we have no idea, right? And that's, you know, so. And I think that one of the challenges there too is that, look, right, I mean, beavers, the places that we need beavers are not the places that beavers necessarily want to live, right? We want beavers up in the headwaters where they're, you know, they're creating all of those little high country reservoirs for us, building dams, forming ponds and wetlands. But beavers are very happy living in, you know, big main stem rivers, right? But those big main stems tend to be where they come into conflict with people most frequently, because that's where we live, you know, in the big valleys. But if we don't get sufficient beaver populations in the lowlands, you know, we can't force those dispersing juveniles to go up into the headwaters where we need them most, right? So to me, I think that, you know, writ large, that's the biggest issue that I see is coexistence in sort of the lowlands, and, you know, on these bigger water bodies, so that we can increase populations to achieve carrying capacity to force beavers up into the high country where we need them most. Because, you know, it's fantastic that, you know, that people like Molly are doing that work mechanically, catching beavers, you know, in the Puget Sound lowlands and moving them. But it'd be even better if the beavers made it up there on their own, right? So, you know, I feel like that's the obstacle, is, you know, is coexistence. You know, in these kind of like beaver black holes that they keep getting sucked into and getting trapped.
And I just want to add one more perspective. You know, Washington is often applauded for its progressive beaver policies and legislation, but it's not all hunky-dory up here. We still have many political battles that we're trying to fight in Washington state. I mean, I mentioned that we're doing all of our relocations on United States Forest Service land, and we're still doing that 8 years later because we've become confined to those lands because it's very difficult to get permissions from other large forested land managers to give us access to relocate beavers onto their properties. The other thing is, I mentioned the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, their certified beaver relocator program. While it's a wonderful program and it's certifying many people to do this work on a much larger geographic scale, that same state department also permits what we call wildlife control operators, who are anyone that wants to go through their training and get a kill trap permit, can get a call from a landowner, make $200 per beaver to remove them from their property, and they can even go up on Forest Service land and trap beavers from our relocation sites. So there's a lot of discrepancies within the state organizations. So those are some of the challenges that we're still dealing with.
I'll just chime in on this one, and full disclosure, Hannah Wilton, who asked the question, is OAC's a grants program affiliate associate. So great question, Hannah. You know, I think in California, the way we approached this, a very small group of us, again, probably 15 years ago, was California, kind of uniquely in the West, was afflicted with a massive beaver blind spot. And the argument about beaver not being native to most of the state was a really interesting conundrum that most other Western states weren't even having that argument. So we as a group had to actually step in and publish those peer-reviewed papers about historic ecology to even be able to say, yes, beaver are native for the most part throughout much of the state. Then we had to then tangle with where I think Ben was at, with the articulate the benefits of beavers and the multiple environmental service benefits and engage with folks. And to be honest with you, we started with the salmon community because that was where the money was, and that's where the $100 million is being spent to recover Coho, Steelhead, and Chinook. And so I brought Michael Pollack down to the Salmonid Restoration Federation to do a talk and eventually a keynote in early 2008 or 9 or so. And you know, by 2012, we had the salmon community on board with beavers, whereas before they were adamant beavers weren't native to the state and they absolutely were bad for fish because they blocked their passage. That took a couple of years of dealing, and I was given the Beaver Award by that same federation in 2012 for innovation, called the Golden Pipe Award. but it was ugly for a bunch of years. The beaver innuendo and the bad jokes is not pretty when you got beaver haters. And that was coming from the restorationist community. Then it was moving into the mountain meadow community, then the valley bottoms, the rangeland rancher folks. So it's history education. It's what we call ecosystem restoration. The restoring of the ecosystem is the work of the day. We don't need to teach beaver how to be beavers. We just need to either stop killing them or help them be better beavers in somewhere else if they're a problem, and coexist with them or move them. And then there becomes policy, and there's laws that got passed of banning recreational trapping for fur in California, not just beavers, but all fur bearers. That was another group of folks. And now we're working on conditioning depredation permits so that you can't, like the 3,000 beavers that got killed in California last year, if you want to kill a beaver now, you have to go through like what we're hoping will be like a 3 strikes rule, like they have for mountain lions in California, where you're gonna have to try to figure out how to coexist with this native organism first, and get the benefits. And then at some point, a lethal permit could be taken. And at that moment, maybe a relocation option, which wasn't available until hopefully now. So, and as you encounter these barriers, you just keep pushing at how do we mitigate the barrier? And ultimately policy change. And if it has to be the legislature, it's fine. It's currently been with the department, and money runs all of that. And so funding, philanthropy, cost share funding, bonds, other funding has to keep showing up, and we're always grateful for that. So it's a multi-headed hydra of an issue, because beaver is a keystone species. It's in everybody's business, and therefore you have to show up like a keystone species with your frontal lobe and your opposable thumb to get her done on behalf of beaver.
And I just want to tack on real quick, because Brock made me think about how instrumental grant funding is to programs like ours. I mean, it's necessary. And the problem is a lot of the available funds out there are really meant to fund one-time projects with really clear-cut deliverables, which our project is no longer. It's become a long-term program upon which many people rely, but every year I probably spend almost half of the year just trying to apply to and maintain funding to maintain capacity for the project to keep it going. So that's a big hurdle and kind of detracts from the whole purpose of why we're doing this.
Yeah, I actually had a question about money, and I might try to illustrate it better with the video I got here. Let me know if you can see that. So here is in Corvallis. This is actually Sustainability Coalition showed me this. This is off of the freeway, and it starts with this tiny little stream, and as you go higher up, it gets wider and wider. And at this point, it's like a 70-foot wide beaver dam, and it just keeps going farther and farther upstream. And what I thought was so mind-blowing about this is, you know, like I've been on projects with Zach where, you know, probably the project budget is $100,000 plus. And they said this was only a pair of 3 beavers built this giant pond, and there's actually 3 or 4 more behind here. How do you get across the financial benefit of beavers to people, to city councils, to people concerned about drought and climate change? How do you show them that, okay, a beaver pond that costs no money just is the equivalent of like save the county $200,000? Or like, how do you get across the financial value of beavers to people?
I mean, I would say, I think you show things like this. You strive to bring enough education to that city council or that agency so that they know enough to even ask the question. And then case studies. So I showed you Doty Ravine, 58 grand for 1,000% increase in wetted area. What you just showed, the Prunedale thing, that was a $1,200 flow control device. That's all it took to create. And so who actually cares? The Clean Water Act for us is sediment reduction, water quality improvement. There's money for that. Endangered species. Is it fish? Is it frogs? Is it birds? Is it turtle? Who cares about that? Flood mitigation, groundwater recharge, peak attenuation, carbon sequestration. The California Department of Fish and Wildlife funded Davis and the Nature Conservancy for $800,000 to do a study in a place called Child's Meadow up in the Lassen area to look at water quantity retention, carbon sequestration, and biological benefits from the beaver to Cascades frog. All of those federal and state agencies and counties and cities have hundreds and tens of millions of dollars to fix that problem. And if Beaver can help them fix the problem, then you're happy to facilitate an introduction to a restoration partner who will do it cheaper, faster, better, without any NEPA or CEQA documents.
That's such a cool part that, that didn't require a permit. Those were just beavers existing, which to me is just the coolest part of it all. And I know we're closing out here. Just want to remind everybody, if you want to continue this conversation, we have the Water Stories community. Of course, it's free. Anyone can join, anyone can watch the replay. We'll post the link in chat, but basically we'll be posting the webinar on there, and you can chat, you can connect, you can watch other webinars we've had on water restoration. But please come hang out there, join, chat, and see some other cool films we've made, like with Dr. Rajendra Singh, the Waterman of India, really cool stuff. So we'll post that chat log. But as we come to the end of this webinar, this has just been extraordinary. Thank you so much for all your time. And Zach, thanks for putting this together. I've been in edit land, and you put together this dream team of Beaver Believers, which is so cool to share with.
Yeah, I mean, really thanks to Brock as well for pulling everyone together. I mean, just what an incredible group of folks we just had here. And really thank you each so much for sharing your knowledge, your skills, your experience with this community. I know they're going to all be, you can just hear the energy in people. They're ready to get going on this. So I think they'll really take your work and be able to implement it in their own region. And thanks for all the tireless effort you have each spent on for this vital organism. You know, I think our non-human relatives need human partners to help share their story. In so many of these decisions are made in in a big building somewhere where the beaver has no voice, they have no presence. And so really thank you, each of you, for being the voice for these relatives, for bringing their story to people with decision-making power, to people who are going to affect the landscapes we have. And would love to, if you guys are up for it, just hear a little brief closing thoughts from each of you. Maybe we go in the same order as presentations. Ben first, if you're up for it. You're on mute there, Ben.
I'll just echo what I said earlier, which is that I'm just constantly amazed by how rapidly the beaver movement is growing and how dramatically it's expanding its sort of purview of ecological benefits, right? I mean, it's really incredible. There's practically no problem that beavers do not have some hand in. There's just a great study, for example, about beavers remediating a Superfund site in Oklahoma, a kind of historical mining impact site where beavers were capturing and sequestering heavy metals. And then last week I gave a talk, and at the end, a guy from the EPA came up and said, "Hey, tell me more about that site in Oklahoma. That sounds pretty cool." It's just. I'm just so thrilled to see the community of Beaver Believers growing, the ecological problems that these animals are helping us tackle, expanding and spreading like water itself. And I'm really excited at the prospect of everybody who watched this webinar joining the Beaver community. So thank you all.
All right, I apologize for my video. I had to relocate into my bathroom because there is now construction happening outside my window. So apologies. But yeah, thank you all so much for listening. Thank you to the other panelists. Your presentations were amazingly inspirational. For all of the people that were inspired today and want to get involved, I really urge you to look at some of the resources that were shared today and look and see if your state already has a beaver working group. And if it doesn't, why not you? Why can't you be the person to initiate some of this work in your state? Yeah, thank you guys so much again.
Thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you, Molly and Ben and Brock. I want to echo some of the things that Brock had stated, and I just, for me and our work in the West, it's really about the water right now, and these droughts and what potentially could be, just a climatic shift. And so how we think about water, how we use water, I mean, every single drop to me is becoming so valuable. And so that's our kind of new quest in the Valley is, rethinking about reestablishing, coming into balance with the use of water. And I think it's essential. Well, it's beyond essential. It's life. And so I just encourage everybody that was here today to in your different areas. And if you're on the West Coast, let's just join hands together and rethink our life around water and how we coexist with our friends, the beaver, who can help us with some of those goals. Thank you, everyone, for joining today.
Thank you, Sharna.
Yeah, I'm giving a big happy beaver tail slap of gratitude to Zach and Raleigh, and always amazing to just be with you, Ben and Sharna and Molly and everybody on today. And yeah, what does it look like to, I emulate beavers as a colonial organism that work together in family groups and that convivial castor comrades. And so the elemental beavers are emergent, where the whole of beaver is greater than the sum of the perceived problems, if you want to get on board with beavers. So the glass is way more than half full with solutions versus half empty with nuisances. So find your local beaver brigade, your beaver keepers alliance, start up a beaver working group, get aligned with folks. I guarantee you align with the beaver believers in your world, and you're going to meet some amazing people who are heart-centered and get her done. And as David Orr says, they have hope, which is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. So roll up your sleeve and let's let that big toothy tailed bugger loose.
Hell yeah. Good, good way to end it. Appreciate you, Brock. All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a great webinar. It's been a really nice spending time with everybody. Well, like the beaver, let's restore our water. Let's work together. Let's restore hope to our world. Take care, everybody. You'll get an email about the replay. Feel free to join us on Water Stories, and we'll post the chat there too. And let's end it today. Take care, everybody. Bye.
All right. Bye, y'all.